Hello, and welcome to episode number 432 of the Armen Show podcast. Science, learning more, creativity, expanding our framework, and learning from past times as we go toward the future. We have a special episode here. Not only do I have a wonderful co-guest host on this one, but I also have a wonderful guest author of this book. We'll get back to that in a second. My guest host, Dr. Amanda Doubleday, is an endocrine and general surgeon. She is in Wisconsin. Got her DO from Kansas City University of Medicine, general surgery residency at Flushing, and did her endocrine surgery fellowship at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, and currently practices in Pro Healthcare Hospitals and is clinical assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison in Wisconsin. Amanda, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you on, and you have known of the content written by our guest today, which is Dr. Emeran Mayer, author of the new book from last year, and which is an iteration of his past book from 2016, which was the Mind-Gut Connection. This is the Mind-Gut Immune Connection, understanding how food impacts our mind, microbiome, and our immunity. Dr. Emeran Mayer is many a thing. Gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and professor in the Department of Medicine, Physiology, and Psychiatry at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, executive director of the Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience, and a steering committee member of the UCLA Microbiome Center, which is mentioned in the book, and I saw in a research paper recently what they came out with. Dr. Emeran Mayer, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Glad to have you on. This is a wonderful opportunity. Now, to start things off, I would like to go to the broad item. You had a best-selling book that has been published in 15 countries and translated into many languages, The Mind-Gut Connection. You added onto it immunity. How is immunity a relevant addition to what was your best-selling book? Why did you add that on?
Well, I mean, it became obvious pretty quickly. I mean, that there's two major elements that I think that need to be added to the mind-gut connection, and one is metabolism, and the other one is immunity. And what's sort of been emerging in my mind is this interconnectedness of these major systems within our body. The immune system is particularly important because our microbes in the gut are just microns away from the immune cells, really just separated by a very thin mucus layer. And the minute they come into contact with the immune system, which normally they're not. So, but once they get in contact, the immune system rings the alarm bells, and there's immune activation in the gut first. 70% of our immune system is located in the gut, and then it doesn't stay in the gut, but it travels throughout the body, to the liver, to the brain, really to all the other organs. So you almost can't understand the impact of the microbiome without incorporating the immune system in that system.
Now, the gut is very important. I spoke about it a few times before, one time with Bill Sullivan of Indiana. He has a book about the gut, and the gut is very important. Amanda, how did you find out about Emeran's work, and what brings up your interest in what he has written about?
So, going back many years, I actually discovered Dr. Mayer when I was introduced to the Amari Global Company. My sister introduced it to me, and she found it extremely helpful for her and her family. And so we started looking at their products. I started taking some of their probiotics, changed my life. And we went to the annual Amari conference. We were in Anaheim, California, back in 2019. And I think you were a guest speaker at that meeting, actually. And another guest speaker was Dr. Michelle Massa. I believe it was Michelle Massa on the wellness committee, and she was discussing herself and patients who had autoimmune thyroid disease. And very proud and happy to say that after some of their products and their program, that there were a lot of people that were happily in remission. And it got me thinking. At that time, I was in my fellowship in endocrine surgery. So one of my primary focus organs was the thyroid, mostly related to surgical disease, but autoimmune thyroid diseases can be a surgical disease. And so started thinking, clearly there's a connection here. And so I actually found Dr. Sean Talbot at the conference, and I started speaking to him and thought maybe there's an idea for a research project here. Could we give some of these products, including the probiotics, to thyroiditis patients and trend their antibody levels and see if they get better, see if there's any change? So we discussed this. We were both kind of really excited about it. I went back to UW and proposed the idea. I actually started up an IRB proposal, which, as you know, can be a very large task at a tertiary quaternary university center. So we had some challenges, we had some roadblocks, and at that time I was transitioning from my research fellowship to my clinical fellowship and just got very clinically busy. We lost someone from our research team to another department, and so the idea kind of just unfortunately fizzled. But clearly I'm still really interested in the topic, and having read your second book, I have more knowledge now than I did then, and happy to have you here to talk about that today.
Interesting.
That is wonderful. Now, I wanted to go into a couple of topics. There's so many wonderful topics in the book. And also, I have to point out, I always look at books in terms of sections, and the recipes at the end is one of the things I looked at first, which is wonderful, an application of how to get good foods into your system. There's a whole section of recipes for anybody that does get the book, and some of them are contributed, many of them by your wife, Minu, which is wonderful. And I'm going to try a few of them, like the avocado hummus. I want to put that in there. Now, into the earlier part of the book, I once read much about there's a connectome for our being. How about the mind-gut connectome? Can you talk about broadly the connections between the mind and the gut and how it connects to the immune system? What are the important parts of our body that are represented in this linkage?
Well, I mean, even though you might think I'm biased being a gastroenterologist, I have to say, and I've focused on gastrointestinal diseases, not health, but gastrointestinal diseases throughout my career. I have to say that I've come to a point writing these books and also in our research that I think this system that connects the brain with the gut and the microbiome is one of the major homeostatic systems in our body, because it ultimately it's the main entry point through the gut and the microbiome of dietary influences and environmental toxins, but also through the brain of many of our senses and psychological influences. And it integrates all of these and translates this into the language of the immune system and the endocrine system. And so systems biology has for me become like really the way to look at health and disease. If you look at individual organs, yeah. So as a gastroenterologist, I started at the time. Peptic ulcer disease was sort of a major issue, and everything was homed on this little hole in the stomach or in the duodenum. In the meantime, we look at this even. Peptic ulcer disease now looked like an interaction between microbes, H. pylori, and mind influences, stress, and the immune system. And I think that model is, I think moving forward for medicine is the only way. I don't know what Amanda thinks about this, but it's really the only way to get past our current siloed, ultra expensive system where no expert really knows about the next step, and they keep sending from one specialty to another if you have a problem. And also, I think it's the only way to overcome this current problem of our chronic disease epidemic, this chronic non-contagious disease epidemic, which includes everything from cardiovascular disease to liver disease, fatty liver disease, to the neurodegenerative diseases, neurodevelopmental we don't have answers for any of these. Medicine has been extremely effective in coming up with vaccines and antibiotics and diseases that have a particular target. And this reductionistic traditional medical model works really well. But if you go to these chronic diseases that we're dealing with now, unless you include everything, including, it goes even beyond the body. If you go to the diet, how is this diet being produced? What is our chemical agriculture contributing to altering the gut microbiome, like glyphosate or any of the other, pesticides? So it becomes, I sort of hate to use that expression, but a really holistic view of health and disease. And I think if you want to overcome this current epidemic, which is extremely expensive, medicine is good in keeping people from dying, but not really preventing people getting these diseases like cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's. But medicine is good in keeping people alive. That's a very lucrative. It's a very lucrative situation actually for the pharma industry to be able to do that. So I think this holistic model, systems biology, and the clinical application of that is definitely a way to go beyond this and have a new approach to it.
I will say recently I did see a graph that shows that goods have reduced in their cost versus inflation versus services, including healthcare, have gone way up in their cost compared to inflation over time. So it will only become more valuable as represented monetarily. Amanda, what are your thoughts on what Emeran was saying there?
I absolutely agree. And I think I've always thought that this approach was important. Starting back to the day I decided to go to medical school, I went to a school of osteopathic medicine, and one of the differences, I shouldn't say differences, but one of the things that we focus on is more of a holistic approach, right? I would say probably the main difference between allopathic and osteopathic medicine is we have additional training in hands-on osteopathic manipulative treatment, which looks at how can we treat the musculoskeletal system in a hands-on approach as opposed to pharmaceuticals. But in general, it's a more of a holistic approach. And I think that's one of the things that drew me to endocrine surgery, is because the idea of the endocrine system is it's a multi-system approach. And I think one of the rewarding things about endocrine surgery is that you can do sometimes a simple, sometimes not a simple procedure, and people have multiple clinical benefits. You can remove an adrenal tumor and people have improvement in their diabetes and their hypertension and their anxiety and et cetera, et cetera. So I completely agree. And I think that I hope we're on the horizon of changing from more of a reactive medical treatment society to proactive and preventative. And I'm fascinated with your research because I think that the microbiome and this gut-brain immune axis is probably one of the keys. Absolutely.
And if I could make another comment to this, the reason that I'm up here in Vancouver at the moment is I'm a consultant for a startup company who's developed this genetically engineered microbes that have some really unique features. For example, they can survive an environment of inflammation, but they can't survive once you pass the bowel movement and get into the environment. They have this kill switch. So it's a very safe approach. And the interesting thing is, we just looked at these preliminary, and I can say this, so this will be published shortly. Looked at the initial outcomes from a pig trial, where these microbes, these engineered microbes. So these are naturally occurring microbes in the gut. And so pigs, because the way they are raised and the whole, pig industry is not something I like to even think about, but they have colitis. These young piglets have colitis. 30% die from this colitis. But with 2 doses of this microbe, that is active only when there's inflammation in the gut and produces anti-inflammatory metabolites like short-chain fatty acids. There was no more inflammation in these pigs, and even more interesting that so the control group in these pigs was so-called healthy pigs, but when they looked at these pigs closer, they're actually not healthy. They're packed with antibiotics, they have compromised microbiome system. They have metabolic derangements. They have liver disease. I mean, it's really remarkable. And even those animals without the inflammation, the so-called healthy animals, these other manifestations of a low-grade inflammation were improved or disappeared. So this is an indication that this concept that we have sort of come up with a lot of epidemiological data, there's not a great number of convincing clinical studies that really prove causality, so we link it all together from association studies. But to me, when I saw this data, this is the first time that if you actually intervene and target one part of that system, that it can have widespread effects, beneficial effects, on both on the gut, but also beyond the gut and metabolism. So this is really exciting. And this is the kind of therapy, I think, in the future that I was talking about, that we need to be thinking about, something that is not, that has these widespread effects, taking advantage of these systems, how they're connected, and I'm sure the endocrine, I mean, there's another example that Amanda probably knows more. There are these sporadic preliminary studies now coming out with Ozempic, that it's not just helping people with weight loss, but it has effects on cardiovascular mortality or morbidity. And I forgot, in which areas these unexpected benefits are popping up. A similar kind of situation where you take a hormone, an endocrine hormone produced by cells in the gut, and if you base your strategy on the receptor of this hormone, it has these widespread effects. I mean, that's too early to really say anything definitive. I'm not a huge fan to treat obesity, the obesity epidemic, with a medication, because 60% of the population is going to be on this medication fairly soon with unknown long-term side effects. But it's also an example of that, how potentially taking advantage of something that starts in the gut is influenced by microbes. I mean, these GLP-1 agonists are released from its chromaffin cells or enteroendocrine cells in response to microbial signals like short-chain fatty acids and secondary bile acids. So it's just another example how this may unfold, this concept of thinking about the system but having an entryway that targets one thing that is based in the gut.
Yeah.
The obesity numbers are very... Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Armen.
Okay. I would say the obesity numbers are very substantial and have increased amazingly the last 10 years, to the point where adults that are obese, huge demographic, and then even overweight, huge demographic, and then the after effects of that, healthcare, mobility, ability to impact the economy, that all has been affected substantially. So that's a huge one right there. I have Amanda look into some more specific questions. I have a broader one that I wanted to throw in there. As far as immunity, what would the average person do? What are some broad strokes that they could do to have their gut lead them to better immunity, or what is causing them to have worse immunity food-wise?
Yeah, so this came up a lot during the during the pandemic that people always talked about, we need ways to boost the immune system or support the immune system. I mean, it's kind of paradoxical because the real problem was there was this exaggerated response. So people with COVID-19 infections who had, these cytokine storms, what it was called, this exaggerated immune response actually did worse. And there was a higher mortality rate. It's really the regulation. It's not boosting it. I mean, the immune system is actually quite, it's a very smart system. I think what we can do with the food is, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier. So the microbes in the gut are microns away from some of these sentinels of the immune cells, the dendritic cells that actually have extensions into the gut, into the mucus layer. As long as this mucus layer is intact, the microbes will not stimulate these cells. But if the mucus layer shrinks under certain conditions with unhealthy food, food low in complex carbohydrates and fiber and polyphenols, then now all of a sudden our normal microbes get in contact with these dendritic cell receptors, and they perceive this as an invasion, as a threat. And they report it back into the gut-based immune system, which then responds with cytokine production, which, as we talked about earlier, also typically does not stay in the gut, but it spreads throughout the body. So I think what we need to think about in terms of diet is diets that assure a healthy, thick enough mucus layer that prevents this inadvertent engagement of the immune system. And the ultimate consequence of this mucus layer shrinking is then this common term that's being used, the leaky gut. So it's not just then the first barrier with this mucus, the second barrier, which are these epithelial cells and these that are connected with tight junctions, so nothing gets through. So once that opens up, second stage, then entire microbes get into the systemic circulation. And the reason that this is dangerous is because the membrane of microbes has these lipopolysaccharides and similar molecules contained, which again interact with receptors on immune cells and engage the immune cell. And these traveling immune cells and some of these lipopolysaccharide molecules can get into the brain as well. They can pass the blood-brain barrier and activate the immune system at the brain level, so the glial cells. And so it's like it starts in the gut with the unhealthy diet that I think in simplest terms you could say an inflammatory diet is a diet that is deficient in fiber and polyphenols and is enriched in chemicals that oftentimes we don't even know what they do. Now microplastics, all of which then get into the systemic circulation through this to this compromised permeability or barrier of the intestine. So I think we know a lot about the general concepts of this. There's clearly a lot of science that's still needed to pin it down to molecular details. But I think the general concept is pretty clear. I mean, like in terms of interventions, dietary interventions, I mean, we know now what needs to be done. It's
that point on microplastics is pretty substantial. I recently saw an image of representation of microplastics in the brain or different parts of the body, and they're just there. That's not great. And then we're all going to develop little bits of.
To me, the scary thing is it has not really rang the alarm bells of the medical community. This is not something that's being talked about every day. Diet is still the main topic, but that with every plastic bottle you drink your water, or the vegetables you get in plastic containers. So even if you're on a healthy diet now, all these fruits and vegetables come in these plastic containers, and they're obviously all contaminated. So I personally don't see any chance anytime soon that this will change, that industry will. I mean, they could, there's other materials. A few companies, have now aluminum bottles and, cardboard bottles. So this could be changed. I don't know why it's not more widespread and why the population doesn't demand it. Why the lay public, the consumer doesn't demand it. It's not penetrated, I think, to a large number of consumers. That's my impression.
It's a common thing where until it hits a certain amount where, oh, okay, this much plastic is in the brain that IQ has actually dropped to 5
right,
across all people, then we might need to do something. Right.
Yeah.
Segue slightly to Amanda here. The gut-mind axis is something you have mentioned. The gut-thyroid axis is something Amanda has looked into. Any thoughts on the gut-thyroid axis or questions there, Amanda?
Yeah, absolutely. But just to comment on what you were saying, there's probably pockets of geographical areas where the discussion you were just having is more common than in other places. I would say probably in the community that I practice, people are more conscious of this. And I, as a provider, do try to talk about this, going back to the holistic approach. When I talk to cancer patients, when I talk to any kind of endocrine patient, first of all, the challenge is that endocrine patients come to me and they think, okay, I have an endocrine organ problem. And we know that hormones play a role in lots of different systems. So I have a list of 20 million things that are wrong with me. Are they all related to my thyroid? Is it my parathyroid disease? And so that's hard to tease out. I'm still learning that because what you read in the textbook is not what the patients present with. So I do go into this sort of broad discussion. I ask them about their GI function. I ask them about their diet. I tell them not to eat and drink out of plastic containers. Don't heat anything in the microwave in plastic because that sort of leaches the toxins out of it. So I do try and have this basic discussion. Then I found myself getting like 20, 30 minutes behind in clinic every day because people want to talk about this and then we derail. So I've come up with these smart sets and links and particularly to your book, I tell people, just go read the book. Read the book, and that's a good jumping off point to give them an overview of the things I'm trying to tell them. So I don't know what my partners do. I don't know what other people, especially in the surgical community, are saying or doing, or the primary care physicians. Sometimes when people have issues that I don't know how to help them, I will refer them to a functional medicine doctor because they might take a deeper dive. So to segue to the gut-thyroid axis, yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic. And, I think there's clear data that there's this bi-directional interplay between intestinal homeostasis and thyroid hormones. And we know that one affects the other and vice versa. There's been a lot of studies that have looked at thyroid hormone and bioavailability and the microbiome and how this is related, but a lot of the specific microbes that have been identified in certain conditions like autoimmune thyroid disease seem to be conflicting or just not consistent. And it seems like a lot of the data is coming from China, but I guess my question for you is, can you comment on microbiome and autoimmune thyroid disease specifically, and if there's ongoing research internationally, or if you have an interest in this?
Yeah, so I mean, I couldn't answer it in terms of specifically the autoimmune form of thyroid disease, but clearly this increase in autoimmune diseases and allergies, I mean, it's sort of a sub-chapter of the overall microbiome story of microbiome science, where we think it happens a lot early in life when, this training of the immune system to differentiate between different harmful and not harmful influences. And that's clearly influenced what happens early in childhood. I mean, it actually is influenced by what happens in the mother. I mean, the mother's diet and stress level, and probably also this consumption of microplastics. ultimately, is transmitted to the fetus, to the growing brain. I mean, I know this about the brain primarily, and also to the microbiome of the mother. So when the baby is born, it goes through this altered vaginal or combined vaginal fecal microbiome, the first exposure to the external world. That what happens in these first few years, 3 years of life, is definitely something that I think is pretty not studied enough. And based on my readings, I'm not an autoimmune expert, but on my reading, the damage is done, or the wrong programming is done early during this time period. Once you have that autoimmune disease, I'm not sure, targeting the microbiome. I mean, you, Amanda, you may know more about this, how beneficial or how effective that is. It's definitely something I think women who want to have a child should think about their lifestyle, the 9 months of pregnancy, how that, what impact this has on the microbiome and also on the development. I mean, there's this once, when you just think about this one fact, so there's studies with autism spectrum disorders, or another study like case like that, where mothers with metabolic syndrome and obesity have a higher chance of having autistic offspring if they also have a family history. And that's kind of easily understandable because, I mean, that low-grade inflammation that the pregnant mother has goes through the placenta to the developing brain and will affect brain development. I'm not sure. This is again something about public awareness. I mean, how many women know about this? Or how many OBGYN talk to their patients about this? But to me, this is something that's definitely has not received enough attention because that's where the problem starts. And there's all this indication, epidemiological indication, that many of these diseases start at younger and younger age groups. So not just the autoimmune diseases, but also the other ones we talked about earlier, from like inflammatory bowel disease is a good example, colon cancer. I mean, why do they start early in life? Like, our screening tools will have to lower the age, the age indication to lower and lower to younger and younger people. But again, this doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, like, so ultimately we're going to do colonoscopies on teenagers because we don't change the system, and we don't pay enough attention on what happened, what goes wrong with this, with this early programming of the microbiome immune interactions and metabolism. So it's
on this point you bring up right here. There's something that makes me think of. I once spoke with Dr. Ajaraza. She wrote The First Cell about cancer and how it starts from the first cell and targeting the early cells. And you brought that up, finding things early. Taking that into a positive note, looking into someone's gut or gut bacteria or their microbiome, what are some items that can be previewed 10, 15 years out that might be issues for them based on that?
Did you pose the question to me or to
Yes,
Amanda?
Both, actually. I will throw
Yeah,
it
so
to
I mean,
Amanda
this
as
goes
well.
into this whole microbiome, the utility of the microbiome testing. And I mean, clearly we have the abilities, and these microbiome tests have improved, initially with this technology called 16S RNA sequencing. Was a pretty crude technique where you get, and with a very low resolution, where you just look at genera, not even species, or definitely not strains. So in the meantime, we have other techniques called shotgun metagenomics, where you can actually look at the gene expression of all the microbes that are in the gut. We can look at the metabolites. So these tests are improving both in their resolution, how deep they can get. They also now look at the function, not just who is there, but what are these bugs doing, which is much more relevant for the disease. You can say there's a few good bugs that are butyrate producers, and that there's other bugs that are pro-inflammatory. But that's a very coarse description of what goes on inside, and doesn't really, at this point, allow you to make predictions, like 15 years down the line. We do know that, for example, that's probably the most advanced in this area, Parkinson's disease, in the majority of patients starts in the gut as well, with changes in the enteric nervous system, and then these degenerative changes moving up through the vagus nerve into the brain, and it's between 12 and 15 years from the time that you could detect the first changes at the gut level in a totally asymptomatic individual, before any neurological problems develop. So I think that the tests right now, I don't think are quite ready to make that prediction. I've kind of made a simple version of this. If patients come to me with a new onset constipation, that never had this problem, and they're like in their 30s or 40s, and they're also then asked, and they also have sleep problems, and if they come with their spouse, the spouse would say, yeah, my husband is thrashing away, and he's never done this before. Just with these two criteria, the new onset constipation and what's called this REM abnormality, you can have a 80% prediction accuracy that this person will develop Parkinson's disease, but maybe 15 years later. I don't think that the microbiome tests are quite at that sophistication yet. They will get there. I think it's you may have to combine the microbiome with some low-grade inflammatory markers in the blood. People are working on that as well. But I think ultimately this prediction for cognitive decline, for Parkinson's, there will be many of these diseases. I think that this will be possible. But even though some of the currently available tests, are definitely improved and better than what was available. They use also artificial intelligence to collect entire literature. So if they find something, their recommendation is based on a AI produced review of the entire world literature on this topic. They're definitely better, but they're not where they will be going, I think, in 10 years from now.
I agree that probably a lot of the problems start early, and it's thought that I never had until just now, but talking to OBGYN and talking to those providers and women who are pregnant, how can we, going back to this idea of preventative medicine, right? Like, how can we optimize mom's health so that baby isn't born with some of these issues from day one? But of course, there's always going to be patients that are going to present later in life with various issues. I probably can't comment on some of the testing to predict some of these diseases. I don't have that knowledge. But there are things that I think I've seen trends in for sure. We know that there are certain viral infections that can trigger autoimmunity. I've had a couple of patients who were on chronic antibiotics for various things, acne, smoldering diverticulitis, in and out of the hospital for various septic conditions, and then they were on antibiotics forever, and then they got C. diff, and it was a whole second and tertiary and multi-factorial issue. Now they've got gut microbiome issues clearly, and so how do we tackle that once it's already happened? And I think that I used to think, well, just give people probiotics. Just give them a really good probiotic and they'll get better, and that's all we need to do. Now clearly, the floodgates have opened, and I realize that there's a lot more to that, and a lot of things that we still don't know. When you discuss Parkinson's, I found there was a section in the book where you discuss Parkinson's, and specifically some studies that have looked at the bioavailability of levodopa and the treatment for Parkinson's, and how there is evidence that if you can optimize or even change dysbiosis to symbiosis in the gut, that the bioavailability of that medication is significantly improved and people are less symptomatic. So I found that really interesting. And of course, my brain immediately goes to what's the bioavailability for levothyroxine, right? Once we take out someone's thyroid, there's a very common and challenging issue of post-thyroidectomy asthenia or chronic fatigue. And we have theories about why this happens. We know that these studies looking at people who've had total thyroidectomies compared to lobectomies, or when you only remove half the thyroid, that patients who get to keep half their thyroid don't have even any of this post-thyroidectomy asthenia or fatigue, or very little reported compared to total thyroids. And so there's obviously some evidence that keeping your native thyroid tissue prevents this, but we don't know why it happens. And so one of my thoughts is it the bioavailability of levothyroxine? And I think that's a really big unanswered question. There's been some people that have looked at it, and even if the thyroid function tests are normal, we still don't know what's happening at a cellular level, and I think that that's probably the issue. So any ideas about how we could look at the microbiome and see if that is linked here or a factor?
Yeah, I mean, these are things. I mean, so this conversation, here is a good example of the benefits of interdisciplinary communication, because this has not come up for me personally. I'm already feeling I have my fingers into way too many things for somebody who wants to say anything incredible. So I mean, just dealing with these neurodegenerative diseases, and I got involved with NIH studies as a co-investigator, ranging from autism spectrum to to Alzheimer's disease. It's like I never thought this would happen in my career, and you can maintain a certain high level expertise or usefulness of commenting on it, but I'm certainly not. I'm neither an expert in either one of these, in any one of these diseases outside the GI tract, but I do follow the literature and see, and then you talk to people in these specialties, and they, even if they're really basic scientists, they do share this view that is, in some ways, it's all connected to the same story that we've been talking about. The early life programming, I would almost say the excessive use of antibiotics for viral infections in childhood. I always now take a history also of that. So I have like a microbiome history, which means, is an individual C-section born or vaginally born? Did they were they prematurely born and were in the neonatal intensive care unit, where they are obviously exposed to antibiotics excessively? Did they have repeated courses of antibiotics as an infant, often driven by the overly concerned mothers, when the child has a bad respiratory tract infection, which is 90% viral, but the physicians give in. And so I think a lot of people are kind of understanding this at a high level, but there's obviously science. Microbiome science at a molecular level is evolving rapidly, I would say exponentially, and there will be more things coming out. And I think the main things that we're missing are these interventions, other than lifestyle modifications. So right now, somebody asking, what can I do if I have any of these problems? It always boils down to lifestyle. Healthy diet, being one of the top, but also stress reduction, like all the things that feed onto the microbiome. Then also, I don't get to see pregnant mothers, but I mean, this would definitely be an important recommendation, even before pregnancy. But I think what the science will do in the next 10 years, it will come up with therapies like these gene modifications that you can insert operants into these microbes that they survive in an inflamed environment and are not killed by inflammation. So that would take a probiotic, but it doesn't really work because in an inflamed gut. But if you could make that microbe survive in an inflamed gut, then it would be highly efficient. So I think there will be much more of these. There's also things coming out, with the microplastic that you could manipulate the microbes to metabolize microplastics. So I think right now I would say we know enough on the general level to give these lifestyle recommendations, but I think for making these both the predictions and the really targeted therapies, I think this will take some time and hard science.
Yeah. So to follow up with gastrointestinal specific issues, I'm assuming some of the therapies you're talking about then would hopefully be therapies for people with inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis.
Yeah.
Maybe even celiac. I mean, people do well in celiac if they just avoid gluten, but still could be a therapy in the early stages of that inflammation. Do you deal clinically with any post-operative patients that may have had partial colectomies or may have an ileostomy or a colostomy? Do you clinically deal with any patients like that and discuss this topic with them and how to help with some of the obvious issues we know they have?
Yeah, it's not a big portion of my clinical practice, but it is interesting that people with a total colectomy, for example, so you would think they live without without a microbiome, which we know is possible in animals, in germ-free animals. They can survive. I mean, they get all kinds of pathological changes, but they can survive. But I think what happens with the colectomy that the microbes look for a different habitat. They move into the small intestine. They colonize the pouch. So it's not a total colectomy. Really surprisingly, is not associated with massive changes that you could blame on the microbiome. That is clearly. Microbes are very smart creatures that, have millions of genes that allow them to adapt to new environments. So I think the reason that you don't see more dramatic changes, bariatric surgery is another one, that transiently changes the microbiome, but then it comes back in its normal composition and function. So, yeah, I would say these surgical interventions in some ways demonstrate more about the adaptability of the microbiome than, causing major medical problems.
I had one thing that came to mind in relation to the Microbiome Center at UCLA. I was looking up material in relation to your book recently, and there was a study that came out a couple days ago, Gut Health Tied to Psychological Resilience. New research reveals gut-brain stress connection. So that's on the resilience end, and then there's the other end of, can the gut be linked to depression? How much of the situation of the gut is connected to someone's strength of well-being versus lack of well-being?
Yeah, so that's harder to measure. So there's, there are these correlational studies, pretty large, coming out of Europe, that have shown correlations, not as strong as I would have thought they would. They looked at thousands of patients. Certainly the animal models are very strong, suggesting that, but then I've become a big skeptic of animal models and making predictions from an animal model to the human situation. I mean, they're good for understanding mechanistic connections or causal connections, but they're not good in predicting human pathology. I mean, depression is a multifactorial disease. Some patients have a neuroimmune component to it, which may be related to what we talked about earlier, this whole systemic immune activation, but not all of them do. So um, this I would say that different from what you see in the mouse, where you see really strong effect sizes from interventions targeted the microbiome. The effect size in humans in terms of depression are probably not as big. It still plays a role, but they're not as big as in these mouse models where you can control all the other factors. I mean, that's one thing I think it's also important to realize in understanding these complex diseases that are not related to one hormone or one receptor subtype, or is that there's always multiple factors contributing, and the effect size is how much each of these factors contributes to the clinical expression, and then how much of that is attenuated by resilience factors. That makes human studies so difficult to interpret and often disappointing that you don't see what you had expected from the mouse model.
Is there any way to actually accelerate or increase the percentage of, why is that the case if human studies are way more effective, that they are left so low on the totem pole until highly necessary?
I think there's two ways that people have been trying this. One is large-scale studies. So I mean, that's definitely one thing that's happening. Large international consortia. I mean, one good example for a national asset is the UK biobase. The UK database, where tens of thousands of individuals contributed pretty extensive amounts of biological and psychological and clinical information. So that's one thing. So you go from these NIH R1 study supported studies in 100 patients, which I think are just not sufficient to give you definitive answers. It's just not. The other one is to use very homogeneous subjects that you select for these studies, that like you try to eliminate all the various other factors, and you try to bring diet is always a big problem. Studies used to rely on food frequency questionnaires, which are notoriously unreliable because patients can't. I mean, even if I ask you, what did you eat last week, in detail, you would not be able to remember it. So individuals just put something in there to make the investigator happy. So this is changing. There's now attempts, a special area called foodomics, where you use metabolomics, studying characterizing metabolites and identifying the ones that come from specific food items, and then with AI you can reconstruct what the diet of that individual is without ever asking them. So that's going to be a huge improvement. So large sample sizes, making smaller but much more homogeneous study populations, and then some of these techniques that allow you to eliminate variability and inaccuracies. If you think about the early microbiome studies in humans, were all done without really detailed dietary assessment or reliable dietary assessment, which is a huge influence on your gut microbes. So it's
Yeah, so to follow up on that, and how, just in general, psychiatric and mental conditions can be related to GI issues. This actually brought up a memory for me when I first you were discussing it in the book. I remember being a medical student back on my GI rotation, and I started seeing obviously a lot of colonoscopies and a lot of patients who had been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome or IBS. And I started to notice a pattern. I mean, ages ranged, but I started to notice younger and younger people seem to be more female, and maybe that's just in the geographical area I was in. Also seemed to be people who were under some sort of physical or emotional stress. You know, these women that were like me in medical school, or in, you know, going through a divorce, or in graduate school, or, you know, whatever. And I started to think that there's got to be a link between their environmental stress and this diagnosis. And at that time, I really didn't understand. Maybe I still don't, you know, understand the diagnosis of IBS, but that I knew it was sort of a diagnosis of exclusion. Like, you have these GI symptoms. We looked at your colon. Your biopsies are normal. We're going to call it IBS. Here's some medication. Bye. Good luck. And that's kind of how I viewed it at that time. And so even back at that time, I started to think there's a link here, and someday somebody's going to figure it out. And so I guess my overlying question for you is, do you think that IBS is still an accurate diagnosis, or really can we change the nomenclature to just severe gut dysbiosis in select patients, or are they two different things?
Yeah, so I mean, IBS, you know, these observations that you made as a medical student, I mean, this has influenced my career also a lot, and came to the conclusion, you know, that the brain and the gut in IBS patients is like two sides of the same coin. It's, you almost can't separate it. Yeah, there's maybe 1% of IBS patients who don't have the low-grade anxiety, but 99% do have it. You know, not clinically relevant, but if you do it a questionnaire, an anxiety questionnaire, you'll pick it up. And it's definitely the prototypical brain gut disease or disorder. And you know, it's been very satisfying for me to see how the Rome Foundation, this organization that sort of is kind of the another coincidence that it's called Rome. It's almost like the Vatican, you know, whatever the Rome Foundation says is the dogma, but they change it every 3 or 4 years because when they meet, they didn't take this into consideration. And but so there's absolutely no question in my mind that bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut is the key for the great majority of IBS patients. The small subsets, but the subsets, you know, that, I mean, we've sort of been identifying a paper submitted right now on individuals with increased stress responsiveness, which we can characterize either with questionnaires, but also with, you know, with gene expression data on genes that are related to the sympathetic nervous system. So that's pretty clear. What's not clear is what role the microbiome plays in these altered brain-gut interactions. It seems to be playing a role more for the bowel habits, or for a bowel habit subtype than in general. So it's not a, yeah, I wouldn't call it a brain-gut microbiome disease. Definitely a brain-gut disease, but I think the microbiome is another modifier in subsets of patients. But I do think they're now called brain-gut disorders, or disorders of brain-gut interactions. It's taken some 40 years before the Rome Foundation agreed on that. You know, 40 years after my group wrote the first review articles on this, proposing that, and there's now, believe it or not, there's even resistance now to sort of reverse that again to the old name functional bowel disorders, you know, which was before. So, but I would say, yeah, if ask me what is the most clear-cut brain gut disorder, it's definitely IBS, and a lot of things that have been talked about and written about, and the medications, they're all suboptimal. And like in my career, I worked at a certain stage with several of the major pharmaceutical companies. But it got really frustrating because, these medications, they're aimed at either diarrhea or constipation, but they're not really IBS medications. I think the IBS medications, treatments are more the holistic treatments, like mind-targeted, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction. They seem to be working at least as good as any of the medications that that have been developed. So I sort of forgot what you asked in the beginning. Is IBS a brain gut disease? Yes, it's officially referred to that. It's DGBIM, disorder of brain gut interactions, and yeah, it's easier than to understand some of the other ones, like IBD, for example, where you also have the brain and the mind and the emotions, which has just recently been accepted and recognized as. So our group got one of the first grants from the Chronic Colitis Foundation to look at this, what role stress has on IBS, on IBD recurrences or flares. And the results come out pretty clear cut. And if you talk to patients, the patients that I interviewed, participants in that study, they all confirmed that, how it started, how it first started. There was always this, and how the recurrences happen. There's always this component of this emotional component and on perceived stress.
Yeah, that makes sense. My initial question was if you think that IBS is really, should we still be using that nomenclature in terms of the diagnosis, or really should it just be called severe gut dysbiosis? And to follow up on that, then how would you counsel your community gastroenterologist? When they have patients that have this diagnosis, how would you counsel them to counsel their patients then if you haven't found the pharmaceuticals to be that effective?
Yeah, so as you know, most people choose gastroenterology because they like the procedures, and it's essentially become kind of a semi-surgical, specialty. And they're certainly not interested in spending a lot like what you do. You must be really an outlier in surgery that you spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes with a patient, explaining the complexity and certainly gastroenterologists are not trained to advise patients on anything psychological or stress or emotion related. So fortunately, there's now a growing group of gastropsychologists and that are promoting these mind-targeted therapies in IBS, and patients are very open-minded to this. 20, 30 years ago, they would not want to do this because they were afraid you just blame their symptoms that they experience real and suffer from as just something hysterical or something psychological. So this has changed. The brain gut model has made this acceptable to all patients. So the first thing I always do in the first 5 minutes of my consultation, when I know it's IBS patients, I present them that model in simple terms and ask them, is this something that you can relate to? And great majority of patients now do. If they don't, if they say, no, there's something in my gut, even though I've had 5 colonoscopies, I said, I'm probably not the right person to talk to because, but I would say there is progress. So these this growing number of psychologists who are focusing on this patient population and publishing on it and presenting it at big national meetings. I think that is changing. There's also attempts to do online CBT. The data on that is not as strong as I would have predicted it to be, but this may be a matter of time to develop, more sophisticated online programs to do it. But that will be the ultimate. So you would just tell your physician, and I partially do this now. I mean, I've worked with one company from the very beginning, developing one of these programs. And right now, we're also doing a research study with that program. And so right now, I would say that's the easiest. So anybody, anywhere in the country can give their patients this website and, sign up for it. And if it's a big city and if it's close to a center like UCLA, so we have this GI wellness program with several psychologists now, and the long waiting lists because patients love it. But that's still sort of the exception. It's not. So what advice would I give somebody practicing in Las Vegas, a gastroenterologist? Or I'm not sure if I think it would be cost effective and worthwhile my time to try to convince that person of some of the things that do work in IBS patients. But with these online, two ways. I mean, one is the reason I like writing these books now and want to continue this to teach a large audience, medical or non-medical, to accept these concepts and understand them. And the other one is, are these online digital programs that I think will get better with time. And there are some pretty good ones on mindfulness-based stress reduction, very popular one, like called Headspace. A lot of people are using that. And yeah. But it's definitely something our current medical system is not really well equipped to deal with. Generally.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that people who don't have training in psychiatry run away from it because it's stressful as a provider. I mean, and I mean, probably in Wisconsin, what we could probably tell people first is just stop drinking beer and eating a lot of cheese. It's probably the first thing that people would need to do. But yeah, I recently listened to your podcast, Dr. Emeran, with Carrie Wengen, who dealt with a lot of VA patients and their TSD, and some of her techniques, which I have to admit for me sounded a little overwhelming to try and even attempt to master. But it sounds like she's really successful with some of her mindful techniques and what she's doing. And, I think that's a unique patient population because those patients are so desperate. They're so desperate because the PTSD is really taking over their life. But for the average person who's just stressed because of having a busy life or 3 kids or their job or whatever, they're more likely to say, I don't have time to learn that. I don't have time to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've run into this. So, we're doing this large study, large NIH-sponsored studies, by Office of Research of Women's Health, where we look at sex differences in brain-gut microbiome interactions. And so one aim of that study is to use online CBT, which is free for participants, and you would think if money was an issue, then that we would have hundreds of people volunteering for this. But this comment comes up, I don't have the time to do this. I can't do this over several weeks, and it's too cumbersome. People still prefer get this pill, and even though these pills in generally just don't work well in the majority of patients, 40, I think it's 40% are not satisfied with, with the currently available medications. And there's quite a few of those now, as you know.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off that same comment about I don't have time, it's probably the same challenge you perhaps run into with patients in terms of just changing their diet, right? I mean, at the end of the book, you talked a little bit about the time restricted diet, and even though it was sort of your anecdotal experience with your family, I thought, that doesn't seem that challenging. I mean, I basically eat like that because of my job and my schedule, but I think a lot of people could. And that's not that challenging. I think the challenge is that, to gather all of these organic, natural foods, it's time consuming. I've been trying to do that basically since I've dove down this rabbit hole of all of this and the concepts in your book. But, fresh food goes bad quickly. You're potentially running to the grocery store multiple times a week. And I don't have children. So what do you tell the person who comes to you that says, I got 3 kids, they got soccer practice, they got piano lessons, I got a spouse, I'm really busy at work. Like, I can't run to the grocery store 3 times a week. How do I eat like this?
Very good point. It's like sometimes I feel like it would be a good idea to write a book targeting this population specifically. How do you manage with practical recommendations? I mean, how do you juggle these challenges? I mean, then there's also, the other big part of the population is from lower socioeconomic levels. They may not be able to afford it. In their neighborhoods, there may not be the markets. There's no Whole Foods or where they can get all these healthy foods, and then it's more expensive. I mean, they have a family meal at McDonald's is cheaper than eating a healthy meal with not with sweet sugary drinks, but with water. It's kind of ironic that we're in a situation that the healthy food is which is more natural, is not affordable or not available to a lot of people.
One thing that has come to my mind is that it's almost an information battle where you mentioned in the book, like sizzling green beans is more likely to sell than if it's not labeled excitingly. Same with videos online, same with like Apple companies, the way they put marketing out versus other companies. They really use words like unleashed and things like that really resonate with people. So maybe if fiber was made like fun fiber or something that made it more flashy, it would stand out. Is there a battle going on against great marketing on the other end that doesn't really support things that they're made to seem more bland but are actually healthier for you?
Say that again. So a battle going on between companies that are promoting unhealthy food and those with
And like using much flashier terminology on things that are not as healthy, and then it's more quick-paced and rapid attention grabbing, and there's not as much of that for what is healthy, what is long-term. Is there a battle of short-term versus long-term in the public landscape?
Yeah, I would say, definitely if you look at TV commercials, the unhealthy food commercials definitely dominate, dominate the airtime, and very effectively. People to wean people off that some elements of unhealthy foods, the huge burgers. It's not a regular burger anymore. It's like this huge composite, with cheese and sauces and like all this stuff that even if it's made with with this veggie-based materials and it's not beef, all the other things that are being added to it, make it unhealthy, and also all these ingredients that go into these into this vegetarian, meat products. It's not. I mean, the last word. I mean, I haven't seen the studies on that, but I'm sure they're ongoing. But they're really beneficial for parameters, like inflammatory metabolic parameters. If you switch to, don't change your eating preferences, but switch it to a plant-based burger or plant-based sausage. Or I mean, the data may be out. I've just not seen it.
One of the comments that I have had from people is with the plant-based meat substitutes that it has a very negative green footprint impact. It takes a lot of water and a lot of money in production to make those things. And so I think that that's been some of the resistance to that. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, obviously, it's a decrease in one of the biggest factors in cutting down the rainforest in Central America and South America is beef production and soybean production. But I think I sort of forgot it now. I once looked at this. What the main if beans are a major component of these plant-based meat substitutes, which would mean it's still it's not neutral to the environment. It may be better. I don't know. But one thing that's definitely clear. I mean, it's an ultra processed. They're all ultra processed foods, and I think the general consensus is, the less processed, the healthier. And if you have a food that has 18 ingredients and procedures that this goes through, it's hard to believe that could be health promoting. That's kind of my impression.
Yeah. I just want to ask one more quick question. You had commented quickly on it's hard to wean people off of some of the fast food chains and the unhealthy food because it's quick, it's cheap, it tastes good, it's addictive, all these things. But I listening to other podcasts, there were a couple experts on at one point on the Darren Aline show that were talking about how your microbiome in response to what you're eating will change its dominant colonies of pro and anti-inflammatory different species, and how over time, if you're eating good quality and healthy foods and these healthy colonies are thriving, that it actually can contribute to your cravings. And so the more that you eat healthy, pure fruits and vegetables, produce foods, that you actually start to crave it more. Do you think that's true?
That you would crave these healthy foods more?
Mm-hmm. Because of what's happening and changing and thriving in your own gut microbiome.
Yeah, so this has always been discussed from early on, that the microbes basically based on their own what they want, they send signals to the brain that influences your eating behavior and eating preferences. That's not really totally been supported but psychologically, I mean, I can tell you this from personal experience, and I don't know if you've gone through the same thing, but writing, particularly after the first book, and then really changing our diet and paying a lot of attention to a lot of details, what foods and the variety of different foods, so not just one vegetable and one fruit, but increase the number of different types of plant-based foods. Our food preferences have definitely changed over time. So you would have to, and I was a big meat eater, and I loved hamburgers and loved hot dogs. I could not go back, quite honestly. I mean, there's something inside of you that, and maybe it's the microbes talking to the brain, or you just feel better, or it's psychological. But then you get also, if you do this, if you change your diet, then you look into, how are these meat products produced, and the whole animal welfare. And once you look into this, that becomes another major motivation that you want to stay away from it, because it's just both from a health standpoint and from animal cruelty. It's so it's, at least for us, that's become sort of a major factor, changing or staying with that eating behavior that we developed.
Do you think that the studies that have looked at animal-based protein versus plant-based protein, I haven't read any of them specifically. I just sort of learned about it from what you referenced in your book, but did they look at the quality of the animal-based protein? Obviously, your McDonald's burger is going to be different than your local
I
no
have not,
antibiotic
yeah,
fed chickens.
I'm not aware. I mean, it's quite possible that if the meat comes from organically grown animals without antibiotics, that would be, maybe it's equal to the plant-based. I mean, so there's a lot of people that think, and I've not followed those studies, that grass-fed beef is good for you. It doesn't have any of the negative connotations. I could not pinpoint the studies that have really addressed that, and if they exist. It's certainly better. I mean, clearly, if you eat something that's not exposed to antibiotics from day one of this cow being born to being slaughtered, that cow that meat is healthier. But I mean, there's also a lot of influence. I think hidden influence, without being a conspiracy theory follower. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, manipulations by industry, by the food industry, of what's being published and what studies are being done and how these studies are biased. And that happened even in the best universities, like at Stanford with organic food, where they basically showed there's no benefit. And then it turned out that this was partially supported by, forgotten about, by sort of a major agribusiness entity. So this is always a danger. I think looking where these studies come from and how it's been supported, where the money came from, and clearly there's a big interest in not publishing stuff that would be going against the traditional interests of these lobbyists.
I once had attorney Carrie Gillum on my show, and she talked about how the agrochemical industry would support certain research or not put out other ones based on them wanting to support. I think it was, the book is called The Monsanto Papers, but it was about what Monsanto did.
Yeah, the whole glyphosate story, I'm sure a lot of stuff was suppressed by doing this, during that time. And still the fact, that the European Union is not banning, there was a recent decision, I think, not banning glyphosate use. I'm sure there was a lot of lobbying going on behind the scenes to come up with that conclusion.
True. Very true. Before I ask my concluding question, Amanda, do you have any last follow-up question in mind?
Just what? But I guess in general, you touched on this a little bit, even in your introduction, about some of the new research and exciting potential therapies that we may have, when you referenced the genetic modification of these microbes in pigs. But what are you hoping for in terms of treatment for the near future? Obviously, we have hopes and dreams about 20, 30 years down the line, but in next 5, 10 years, are you expecting that there's going to be a breakthrough related to any of these topics?
Well, as you know, at the moment, it's the focus is on probiotics and prebiotics. Yeah, they seem to be benefiting some individuals. Everybody's microbiome is different, so they don't work in everybody. Some companies, some products have bypassed this issue by putting so many different strains into their probiotic. If you just take a single strain, that plays a key role in, like, there's one, this organism called Akkermansia muciniphila, and they seem to be this company that sells this, markets this as one of the best things that you can do for your gut health and metabolic health. But it's limited. I don't think that the conventional probiotics, and the basic principle is a very large, like billions of units in a capsule, which your gut normally would never get from food. From food you would get like much smaller amounts, but a big variety if you eat a varied plant-based diet. So if that approach where it's going now, so the marketing is, we have 2 billion units, active units in our product, as opposed to somebody who's only 1 billion. If that's really the way forward, I've not seen dramatic differences. What I've seen in my patients, some say, well, they ask you what probiotic would you take, and say, well, then I asked them, are you on one already? And said, yeah. Does it really make a difference? And the majority says, we don't know. Some people would never stop it. A small number of people say, it's so good for me, I would never stop it. But the majority of people don't know. If you tell them, I would stop it and use something else, a different product, they would probably do it. So I think the benefit, and there's some exceptions. I mean, like post antibiotics, there's fairly good evidence, even though there's contradictory evidence as well, that helps you to normalize your gut microbiome faster. A couple of studies out of Israel have shown it actually takes more time to return to your normal microbiome. That controversy has not been settled. So I think probiotics are not prebiotics. In some ways, so these are basically fiber molecules. That makes some sense. If you don't want to eat a fiber-rich diet, to take capsules with fiber, definitely has some benefit. But it's an unnatural way, I would say. Why not focus on eating more natural fiber products? With the probiotics, it's also, is this special yogurt, is that a breakthrough, eating this yogurt every day, or is it better to swallow a capsule with these billions of microorganisms? Or what I recommend, try to do a varied amount of intake with different kind of naturally fermented foods. Just some evidence that is beneficial for the diversity of your microbiome. But I don't see anything right now that is game changing, quite honestly, in the next couple of years. I don't see that. I'm pretty optimistic, and it will be interesting to see how the public reacts to this concept of genetically engineered microbes. There was an attempt earlier, I think it's almost 10 years ago, with butyrate producers for IBD. That did not succeed. That clinical trial did not succeed. It may be because in an inflammatory environment, these probiotics could not survive. So that may have been the reason. But I could see a backlash from the public saying, we're not going to eat genetically modified, bacteria get into our system. That's hard to predict, how this will. If you have a serious disease like IBD, you probably will do it. If you will do it as a healthy person with metabolic syndrome or diabetes, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if you were a patient that had IBD and really struggling, they're probably pretty desperate. I'd try anything. So just to kind of clarify then, if a patient comes to you and says, I'm going to do a probiotic, I'm set on doing it, I'm going to try and change my diet, but I do want to do a probiotic, which one should I take?
Yeah,
Do you basically just tell people it's trial and error?
I mean, there are lists of, there's an organization, I forgot it now, what the acronym is. There's an organization that lists, recommended probiotics, and it's the official, organization supported by professional organizations. It's not, anyway, I can't think of the name right now. I personally go after if these are companies that have been willing to invest money in clinical research studies and have demonstrated an effectiveness. I would say that's sort of my main criteria. And so I will always say do the natural fermented food thing, but if you want to pick one item, then I would use these criteria and I know on this podcast, if you can name any commercial entities, I usually refrain from it because I'm not advertising for them. But we've worked with companies that have spent a lot of money on clinical studies and legitimate studies, well controlled. And there's a couple others, we're doing really, really good research on it. They're willing to do this. But these companies are relatively rare because you're taking a big risk that the study comes out negative and then they shot themselves in the foot. So, but I would say evidence coming from well-controlled studies is still the criteria that I would use, what I would recommend, and that leaves it down to less than a handful of products that I would then recommend to a patient.
My last question for you is, I always like to check this. If you had one message you would want people to take away from the mind-gut-immune connection, what would that message be?
Well, this message would be that this chronic non-contagious disease epidemic that we're experiencing, that a lot of people are not seeing as such, because everybody is on statins, everybody is on anti-diabetic medications. So, fewer people are dying from cardiovascular disease, even though the prevalence is going up of the disease. So people are not perceiving this as an epidemic. The pandemic was a different story. So I would like people to take away the message that we are living in this epidemic. We don't have medical answers to change the trajectory of the epidemic. We can save lives and decrease mortality, but we can't. And that all these disorders have a strong component of starting in the gut and the interaction of microbes with the gut-based immune system, and then the dissemination of the immune activation throughout the body, affecting virtually every other system, the endocrine, the metabolic. So I think that's the main message, that we understand so we understand the problem. We need to see this in a different way, see it as a major challenge, not something that we can live with. Like in England, I heard 70% of people over 60 are on a statin. It's almost become the norm, and the same thing may happen with Ozempic if Medicare picks it up. Probably 70% who are now obese or overweight will take Ozempic, and that's not the answer. It's definitely. Yeah, I would say that's the main message, and everybody can do it to a certain degree by looking at the factors that affect this gut connectome or this mind-gut connection, which are all lifestyle factors, not just food, but calming the mind, having healthy sleep, having a sleep hygiene, exercising regularly. So there's, these factors that we know now from many studies that are beneficial. There's certainly a lot of evidence for that now, and everybody can do it, and it's not as expensive as some of the other approaches, spending or having a budget of $200 or more a month on supplements. I think but hopefully that message gets across. I think people were more fascinated with the mind-gut connection alone. I'm not sure if everybody got that idea already, that it's just not limited to the mind and the gut. The immune system plays this big amplifying role in it.
It makes sense. Adding on that extra component, Dr. Mayer and Dr. Doubleday, I would like to thank you both for joining on this episode, providing a wealth of knowledge, a lot of it connected to this book, The Mind-Gut-Immune Connection, and educating our readers on their internal systems and how they are connected. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you, Armen. It was a pleasure, and nice meeting you, Amanda. Hopefully our paths cross face to face sometime in the future.
Wonderful. Yes. Nice to meet you, Emeran. And thank you, Armen, for having me.
Glad to. And we are out.